Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this The Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And just getting right into this, to absolutely nobody's surprise but everybody's disappointment, the Labour Party have decided to renege on their commitment to a inquiry, 5 regional inquiries it would have been, into the grooming gang scandal. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, I'll let Jess Phillips take it away.
I will make a statement updating the House on the government action to tackle child sexual abuse and exploitation and on progress on the recommendations of the independent inquiry.
From experience, it is never good news when Jess Phillips has to say anything, because she is the theoretical moral coward when it comes to, well, any moral issue. But she is supposed to be the safeguarding minister for women and girls, and yet, as we will see, as far as she will go, it will only be the safe options or the most virtue-signalling options that she will actually back. A reminder that when a Sky News reporter was out in the streets during the summer riots and had a few people of minority complexion, we'll say, in balaclavas intimidating her, Jess Phillips had absolutely nothing to say. She only had things to say about the rioters that were of majority complexion. She is a complete moral coward, and I'm expecting the worst here.
Child sexual abuse and exploitation are the most horrific and disturbing crimes, and abuse of power against those who are the most vulnerable, leaving lifelong trauma and scars.
Yep, totally agree. So what are you going to do about it?
All round, we are making progress at every level to increase the number of investigations, increase the number of arrests, and most importantly, the number of victims who are seeing their attackers brought to justice.
And she does go through a whole bunch of statistics about how the task force is arresting, 500 or so suspects in these rape gang cases, which is perfectly good to see. However, as we always say, this was an industrial scale crime. 500 probably just about touches the sides of what this issue actually involves. Hence there's demand for a national inquiry, because it's not just the actual rapists that we want to see brought to justice, it's people that were involved in the cover-up. The problem with Labour is that an awful lot of them were involved in the cover-up, and the thing is, the Tories for 14 years were effectively part of that cover-up, insofar as they'd have inquiries, they'd take ages, but really not a lot else was done about it. Okay, they brought in a task force to deal with it, and it seems to be doing its job, but ultimately we want to see councillors, we want to see people in charge of the police at the time brought to justice as well, because they stuck their head in the sand over this horrific crime.
Action on CSA since the election means we are introducing a new child sexual abuse police performance framework, including new standards on public protection, child abuse and exploitation. Legislating targeting online offending, including abuse and grooming enabled by AI.
Okay, I'm not necessarily against that. What is odd here is that the main issue is these gangs that have got away with it for so long. It's weird that it would start with online grooming, which, don't get me wrong, it does happen and I'm glad to see it dealt with. It's just an odd thing to start with.
Baroness Casey's 3-month national audit on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse is ongoing. It is building a comprehensive national picture of what is known about child sexual exploitation, identifying local and national trends, assessing the quality of the data, looking at ethnicity issues faced, for example, by cases involving Pakistani heritage gangs, and reviewing police and wider agency understanding.
Good, well, at least something's ongoing, and at least it's, yes, looking into the ethnicity of perpetrators, because there is definitely an ethnic issue here.
We are developing a new best practice framework to support local authorities which want to undertake victim-centred local inquiries or related work, drawing on the lessons from local independent inquiries like Telford, Rotherham and Greater Manchester.
Again, still doesn't seem too bad, does it? Local authorities want to hold their own local inquiries? Well, we're going to help them do that. Are you going to give them statutory power? Probably not.
Alongside this, we will set out the process through which local authorities can access the £5 million national fund to support locally led work on grooming gangs. Following feedback from local authorities, the fund will adopt a flexible approach to support both full independent local inquiries and more bespoke work, including local victims panels or locally led audits into the handling of historic cases.
Yeah, so this is where the big issue comes in. Labour was originally going to run the 5 local inquiries into the grooming gangs, and now they've gone for a different tact, which is effectively we'll leave it to the local councils to do with the £5 million fund as they wish. I want to also point out It was 10 million, but I would imagine 5 million went into actually looking into whether it's worth doing these local inquiries, or rather it would be worth doing, quote-unquote, this locally led work. It's better than nothing. It is not what was promised. And either way, a national inquiry is really what's needed, and the only power there is that can implement that is within Parliament. And they're not doing that. And this is why you need to vote reform, because they will do it.
Much of this crucial activity builds on the vital work of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse undertaken between 2015 and 2022. The publication of that final report 2.5 years ago should have been a landmark moment, but instead the victims and survivors were failed again. None of the inquiry's recommendations were implemented or properly taken forward by the previous government in the 20 months they had to do so.
Yeah, Jess Phillips there is explaining exactly why almost nobody trusts the Tories when it comes to this particular issue. Yet this independent review that took 7 years to complete, by the way, and was one of the most detailed investigations into child sexual exploitation, and also touched upon the ethnic component to it, none of the recommendations were actually implemented by the Tories. And as is mentioned, they had nearly 2 years actually to do something about it, and they didn't. What's the takeaway from that supposed to be? Amazingly, at least we can say Labour are doing slightly more than the Tories by implementing some of the basic recommendations. However, as they mentioned, they are not running their own local inquiries. They are letting local authorities run them themselves. And once again, the problem, as mentioned before, is that they will only be able to go so far, assuming they even have some statutory privileges to actually compel witnesses to get involved. But the thing is that councils can cover up their own inquiries, which they probably will do. They'll probably throw some lower level policemen under the bus, they'll review cases again, and it will probably go nowhere. Even so, this is less than what they said they would do back in January. So again, as far as I'm aware, you can't trust either party when it comes to this. However, at this point, I will be absolutely fair here. Katie Lamb does very well in trying to push back on this ridiculousness. It's worth mentioning that while Katie Lamb was a secretary to some Tory ministers over the past decade or so, she was not an MP until 2024, and so she can't exactly be blamed for previous government's failures. She didn't have any power, and she wasn't an MP. So it's definitely worth listening to her rebuttal on this.
In January, the Home Secretary said the government would conduct 5 local inquiries into the rape gangs which have terrorised so many innocent children. Over 3 months since the government announced these local inquiries, Tom Crowther KC, a barrister invited by the Home Office to help establish them, knows almost nothing about their progress, and neither do we.
Yeah, this is the other side to this, which Jess Phillips obviously didn't mention. There was a KC invited to partake in the inquiries, and he's heard nothing since January. Absolutely nothing. They don't seem to be going ahead. The reason for this, from what I can tell, is because it's not government-led anymore. Instead, it's a local authority-led, council-led, and the council probably aren't going to use the 5 million, or 1 million each, I guess, to actually run these inquiries. They're probably going to use it more for victim support and things like that, which isn't wasted money. However, it is not what the government promised.
Why is the framework for local inquiries now being led by ministers rather than by independent voices such as Tom Crowther? Why is the £5 million set aside for inquiries no longer being allocated, but instead delivered on an opt-in basis? And what does the government intend to do about local leaders who say there is no need for an independent inquiry, like in Bradford or in Wales?
All very good questions, and as I say, you can't say to Katie Lamb, well, why didn't you do anything when you're in power? Because she wasn't in power, she was just a secretary to some of the ministers. So I'm more than willing to hear her out and, well, not get cheeky with it, so to speak. I am more than willing to hear her out. Hell, maybe Reform should try and poach her. I doubt that will work, but hey, it's worth a try.
The girls we are talking about, Mr. Speaker, are predominantly white. The men who preyed on them were predominantly Muslim, generally either from Pakistan or of Pakistani heritage.
Bringing the ethnic components up in Parliament as well, forcing Jess Phillips to listen to this, I think it's an excellent show. This is a good opportunity to put her under pressure, absolutely.
One of the victims from Dewsbury was told by her rapist, I quote, "We're here to fuck all the white girls and fuck the government."
And she does go through an awful lot of anecdotes like that, which again I think need to be heard in Parliament, but I'm largely going to be skipping over them because one, we've heard them before in previous videos, and two, I think that first opening anecdote there pretty much does the job.
Will the Minister accept that, in many cases, these crimes were racially and religiously aggravated? How, without a national inquiry, can we understand what part these factors played?
Once again, reasonable, something that a lot of people have been asking for quite some time. Labour's still avoiding it. What's the reason, you might ask? Well, one, they were involved in the cover-up, an awful lot of their councillors were at the very least, and two, frankly, a lot of them are possibly reasonably cowering at the fact that, well, think about Jess Phillips. I've gone through it before. She complained that an awful lot of quote-unquote men were trying to intimidate her and her team when they were going around canvassing in Birmingham Yardley. She would rarely ever mention their ethnicity, however, you cannot avoid the cameras at the count where an awful lot of people of certain minority complexion were there effectively causing a scene, not allowing her to do her speech, and she was visibly shaking. If you want to see that, one of my old videos on Jess Phillips goes through it. Again, possibly reasonably cowering here, but at the same time, this is failing an awful lot of people. You are supposed to have some sort of representation of these people, and also, let's face it, a lot of Labour MPs need security now. There's probably some reason to that. None of them are willing to go into details as to why. So Katie Lamb's just throwing it in their face.
So why have ministers refused to establish a dedicated unit in the National Crime Agency to investigate councillors and officials accused of collusion and corruption?
Again, it's a really unfortunate thing, but why didn't the Tories do this? It's something that is going to have to come up every time any Tory says this. Appreciated, Katie Lamb was not an MP at the time. However, she was working within the party. She is part of the party. It's unfortunately a question that's going to be asked. Again, good question to ask. Another question, 14 years you were in power. Just saying.
And I am sorry to say that that unit, Mr. Speaker, must also investigate police officers. In one case, the father of an abuse victim in Rotherham was arrested by South Yorkshire Police when he attempted to rescue his daughter from her abusers.
Yeah, and once again, like we've seen in the past, typically these local authorities will throw the officers doing the arrest under the bus, rather than the people who are overseeing this whole thing who allowed for it to happen. Honestly, this goes all the way to the top. The only way this is being properly investigated is if you have someone, if you have a party that isn't Tory or Labour being involved in it, I'm afraid to say. It's going to take a hell of convincing for me to prove that the Tories have changed tact. And even Robert Jenrick I don't think is good enough for me. He's got the best chance, I will give him that, but very, very far away from convincing me.
How, without a national inquiry, can we know how and why these monsters enjoyed effective immunity for so long? And how can we be sure it will not happen again? We on this side of the House have voted for a national inquiry and tabled amendments which would guarantee the publication of ethnicity data on a quarterly basis, terminate the parental rights of convicted sex offenders, and make membership of a grooming gang an aggravating factor during sentencing, so that offenders get the longer, harsher sentences they deserve.
Once again, all good ideas, all good questions to put to Labour. The problem you end up having is that Tories will go very hard on this grooming gang stuff when in opposition, though they haven't been in opposition for 14 years. But when in power, they will have these inquiries and then not act upon them. And then Labour will act upon the bare minimum for them, while the Tories pretend that they're going to go hard on it. And Katie Lamb, I am fully willing to accept that she does care about this and does want to go hard on this. But the problem is that you're also going to have a fair few amount of Tories who are also involved in the cover-up, and then the question becomes, well, how much are they willing to cover up their own involvement in this? Katie Lamb probably has absolutely zero involvement whatsoever. She probably wants to go hard on it. How much does the rest of the party want to, is the question. Because you rarely hear Kemi Badenoch talking about this, and she's supposed to be the leader. Obviously the person acting as leader, largely because he has time to, I suppose, is Robert Jenrick. Now, as I say, he does do a good job, but unfortunately, he was an MP for some years, and his internal pressure for stuff like this, I don't recall seeing him in the papers too much when grooming gangs were being pushed over the past decade or so. My, I think, justified worry is that the Tories will get in again, and we don't know how seriously they are actually going to deal with this issue. I have more trust in Reform to actually deal with this because, frankly, what do they have to lose? What was their involvement in any of this? The answer, absolutely nothing. Therefore, when they get in, there seems to be absolutely no reason that they would pull punches on this. So, I will give a slight defence to the Tories at this point, though, because of their abject failure and the fact that their donors are all falling apart. It does actually seem that they are being forced to reform themselves to some extent. Quite a few people have defected, for instance. They're having to cut a hell of a load of staff because they can't afford them. It is actually reasonable to think that there's a possibility that the Conservative Party will reform themselves, where they will have no choice but to not pull any punches. So I'll give them that, but frankly I just don't trust them at the moment. And I certainly don't trust they'll do anything serious about this under Kemi Badenoch. Anyway, Katie Lamb finishes off with a court note that I have read before about the terrible suffering that a victim of these grooming gangs suffered, and it is pretty horrible stuff, but I'm not putting it in the video in the interest of time and because I've covered it before. Anyway, Jess Phillips then has a response to all of these questions.
I think it's a shame that she only referred to one sort of child abuse victim when the statement is clearly about all child abuse victims, of which there should be no hierarchy of who is. We are talking about also children raped by their fathers.
Kind of crazy the whataboutery that she tries to play here. Yes, there are other types of sexual abuse victims. They've typically not been ignored to the extent that Katie Lamb was bringing up about those raped by predominantly Pakistani or Muslim perpetrators. And we have the statistics on it. We know that there is a overrepresentation in some areas of these particular gangs, of these particular ethnicities. The genie's out the bottle. You can't hide it. That's why you have to whataboutery. Oh, why is she only talking about that? Because it's a massive issue that a lot of people want dealt with. Honestly, this is what I mean by she is the perfect poster child for moral cowardice. But the thing is why is she doing this? I can give you a very quick and easy reason. Because she is literally under threat of violence if she properly does anything about this. That is why. But she will never admit that.
Notwithstanding the very graphic and upsetting stories that she did tell, obviously I have worked for many years with those exact girls, and actually much of what the Honourable Lady already knows is because of inquiries that have already occurred, such as in Rotherham, such as in Rochdale, such as the 2-year inquiry as part of the ICSA panel, which she didn't refer to at all, which clearly looked into lots of areas and was a statutory inquiry. I wonder if she maybe wants to readdress herself with the 200 pages of that report.
This is kind of nuts to me as well. Jess Phillips up here saying, I've met all these victims, I know the horrible things that they went through, and so that just... all it does is strengthen Katie Lamb's point. Oh, you know all of this horrible stuff. Why are you trying to whataboutery your way out of this then? Why are you not doing more of what you promised and implementing more of the suggestions from the 7-year independent inquiry? And I suppose a fair point is made that, well, we already know most of this because of inquiries that have already happened, and it is always on my mind of how many more inquiries do we really need? I don't think it's a waste of money to do a national statutory inquiry. I said back at the time, regional ones will be largely pointless because councils can just cover up their own involvement in it. But the fact of the matter is that we've had a national inquiry. It was to look into all child sexual exploitation rather than just the grooming gangs. That would be worth going into. Yet it's not happening. It's certainly not happening under this Labour government. And again, I don't know how much trust I have in the Tories to actually do it, even with Katie Lamb, who, as I say, is very good. So yeah, this looks pretty horrendous from Jess Phillips, yet again, but I didn't expect anything different.
I understand the sense of anger and urgency over the issue from the Honourable Lady. None of this is her fault. She wasn't there at the time, but she works with the shadow ministers who sat in offices where I now sit, who did not lift a single finger when it came to the J inquiry.
Once again, Jess Phillips pointing out my issue with having to trust Tories on this. 14 years didn't do anything, and as I said, Yeah, she wasn't an MP. She did work with ministers at the time, though, and those ministers didn't do anything. Again, I'm not blaming Katie Lamb directly for any of this, however, she was part of a team that did do nothing.
On any of the recommendations it contained, take the Shadow Home Secretary, who spent almost 2 years he spent as the Minister for Policing and Crime. He had 352 external meetings he held during his time in that role. 352 external meetings, including 23 separate meetings on policing of protest. Not once did he hold a discussion on grooming gangs.
I mean, it's classic Labour to go into, oh, we should have a right to shut down entire cities. But she is absolutely right to say he had 300 odd meetings and not once did he have one about these grooming gangs. Labour have actually technically done more. I hate to say it, but it's true. Again, this is why I have trust issues with the Tories at this point.
Or what the police were doing to investigate them. Not one meeting with the police, or with victims, or with local authorities, or with Alexis J, who had some choice words to say about some of the special advisors, I don't know if she knows who that was, in the department when she was trying to get her requirements across the line.
I don't know why Jess Phillips didn't start with this stuff. This is a much better critique of the Tories' time in power than trying to whataboutery with, oh, but think about all of the other types of sexual abuse that, once again, are dealt with much better than the grooming gangs. This is the whole point. Again, Katie Lamb's speech was excellent. This is why Jess Phillips cannot exactly deny anything that was said in it, and why she has to attack her colleagues, who actually are the problem, rather than Katie Lamb herself.
What I will say is that the government has today published an action plan with all of the details, a plan for the future that is systematic, that is not about headlines, it is about the front line. It is about how these things are going to take time. Yeah,
and at that point I'm switching off with Jess Phillips. Just nonsense, don't believe it. They're not going to do anything serious about grooming gangs. They're too implicated in it all, and their party is too. Another factor is that if they seriously were going to do anything about this, you would see riots. You would absolutely see riots. Why do you think the police are constantly in contact with quote-unquote community leaders? It's effectively to say, listen, we've got to do something about this. You've got to throw some people under the bus. Otherwise, we're going to have direct violence within the streets, and your community will likely be on the receiving end of that, and we will not be able to control it. So give us a few sacrificial lambs, and that's largely where you see the court cases going. Because it's way bigger. As I say, we've probably not even touched the size of this scandal, or just about touched the size, I should say. But there's way more to do. And I think it's going to be difficult for absolutely any government to do it. But the last two governments I would trust to do it are those who are directly involved in the cover-up, which is both the Tories and Labour. Labour are way worse, don't get me wrong. The Tories have some guilt in this too, though. And you may be thinking, what about the other alternative party? What about the Lib Dems? Well, this is the Lib Dem representation in this debate.
Testimonies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I say my blood is boiling listening to this stuff coming from the Conservative benches. If they had read the ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, they would recognise that there are hundreds of thousands of people alive today, people just like me, white girls, who suffered at the hands of white men, and they've just got clean away with it because nothing was done for so long. I welcome the statement that was made today.
Yeah, once again, I'm very sorry to this woman for having to suffer through abuse when she was younger, but this is what we're dealing with from basically every party to, frankly, the left of the right wing of the Tory party. Her blood is boiling because an issue was brought up about, frankly, predominantly Muslim grooming gangs. That is what the problem was. It was brought up because it's largely been ignored. Okay, yes, there are some cases with non-Muslims who were indeed ignored, not taken seriously, whatever. Truly, also a terrible thing that needs to be dealt with, and it's good that this seems to be dealt with as well. However, it is also true that an awful lot of these grooming gangs, which involve predominantly Muslim men, have been covered up more so than anything else. This is why it is at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak. And having your blood boiled because that's being pointed out, yeah, that does not instill trust from people that you will actually do anything about it or support anything to do with it. It's just crazy. This is the reaction to bringing up this sort of thing in the Westminster bubble. You get shamed for it. It's absolutely ludicrous. Both Labour and the Lib Dems did it, some left wing in the Tories do it as well, because they're practically Lib Dems. It's not a good look. It's not a good look at all. Anyway, more details on these inquiries are as follows. Charlie Peters, who is incredible, probably the best source for the grooming gang issue, has said that the Oldham inquiry is still going ahead as it was confirmed in January. This was one of the pilot schemes. The government was expected to announce a further 4 locations before Easter, but is now announced a watered-down approach which can include alternatives to inquiries. I understand that Tom Crowther KC met with Oldham Council officials today to discuss the next steps and timings of the inquiry, which from what I understand is the first thing he's heard about these inquiries since January. So at least one of them is going forward. Thank God for that, I suppose. Small mercies, etc. Anyway, you may be asking, where was the Reform representation in Parliament for this debate? Well, as you can tell, the House was largely empty. That is because MPs are typically doing other MP duties, or given that we have elections coming up, both by-elections for parliamentary seats and also for council seats, a lot of the Reform MPs were around doing their part for the election cycle, which I don't think is particularly unreasonable, because at the end of the day, what more can they say than what Katie Lamb already said? However, it's not like they were silent on it. Nigel Farage at 9 o'clock yesterday posted this to his Twitter account to make his position clear on the entire scandal.
The mass rape scandal by men of predominantly Pakistani backgrounds against young white girls in northern cities shocked not just us, but the whole of the world.
Yeah, I've had people recently saying that Nigel Farage never mentions this stuff. I don't know why they say that. He's been mentioning this stuff for over a decade. I have no idea where this idea comes from, but here he is saying this is the problem, it needs a solution. So there you go.
And as the years go by, more and more comes out, and we learn that this sort of thing is still going on. And that's why I tried to push the government into holding a full national inquiry. Now, of course, they ignored me, and they announced they'd do 5 inquiries of their own. So I dropped the idea of pushing myself for that inquiry because it would not have statutory powers. I wouldn't be able to get, Rochdale, Rotherham, Oldham Council to appear and give testimony.
Yeah, and this is the thing I was going through with Rupert Lowe's idea for the $500,000 he's raised so far for his inquiry the other day. These inquiries are all well and good, and new information could possibly come out if people willing to give information do give the information. However, the people that really need to give their answers on all this, such as Labour councillors, such as police and crime commissioners, will need to be compelled to give their witness statements. You can't do that with a private inquiry, and therefore the results of that inquiry will not be as meaningful as the national inquiry that took 7 years, as was mentioned earlier in the video. That's not to say it's pointless, necessarily. However, it is clear that it was a bit of an empty threat, let's say, from Nigel Farage. A lot of people are saying he was lying about it. I suppose you could say that. He did say he would do his own inquiry. However, as it turns out, when he's looked into it, it's probably not the best move. And so he's dropping that, and in fact, he's deciding to go and pivot to an alternative. People are seeing this as a really bad thing. I do not understand where that idea comes from, but we'll get into what he says.
Well, today, on the eve of the parliamentary recess, in a cowardly act, Jess Phillips says that the 5 inquiries the government were going to hold have now been cancelled.
Yes, and while there are alternatives for it, it may as well have just been cancelled.
You've got to ask yourself, why are they doing this? Well, here's an amazing fact. More people have been imprisoned in Rotherham for rioting after the murder of those 3 young girls in Southport than have ever been imprisoned for taking part in the mass rape of young girls. And we're talking about over 1,000 suspects, and yet only 42 have been put in prison.
Yeah, once again, this is sourced by Charlie Peter, who reported for GB News that the number of people jailed for rioting at the Rotherham Asylum Seeker Hotel has overtaken those locked up in the grooming gang abuse in the same town. And obviously, nationally, more people have been put in jail for rioting all over Britain than have been put in jail for grooming young girls. Now, don't get me wrong, there are rioters that do deserve to be in jail, there's no doubt about that. But it is funny how it's clear that the state has the power to effectively rush through these court cases and then sentences, and yet when it comes to the grooming gangs, they're very slow with it. And the Tories were slow as well, it's worth bearing that in mind. This isn't all just Labour. And so it's absolutely right to bring this up, and I think it's a statistic that will astound most people. Decades-long scandal that we know a fair bit about now. 50 people are in jail for it. You look at the literally last year, all these crimes were committed, hundreds of people in jail. They rushed it through. That will raise a lot of questions for people.
This government is pandering because it's scared of the Gaza independence. It's scared of that extremist Muslim vote that exists in our inner cities.
Again, this is frankly a bit of a dog whistle. Yes, the vote is part of it, but realistically, as I went through, we saw some pretty direct reactions to the Rotherham riots, is what I'd say, to which, as we saw from Jess Phillips herself, they didn't have too much to talk about. It was mainly and again, some of them deserved jail time, but it was mainly the predominantly white rioters that they focused on, because at the end of the day, rioting is not acceptable in Britain. And it is no secret that MPs have been intimidated by this Muslim vote, if you will, or these Gaza independents and the people that vote for them, only the people that vote for them. The Gaza independent MPs seem largely civil. And obviously, as we saw at the count with Jess Phillips, they got very rowdy. There were claims from Jess Phillips that tyres were slashed, intimidation was happening. Clearly, it's a little more than just losing the vote that they're afraid of, but, if he mentions that directly, obviously, once again, there will be too much of a distraction from the point he's trying to make, which is obviously, Labour are failing us, I'm going to do what I can to help the situation.
And yet, if white people behave badly, they're imprisoned. If white people actually put out really offensive posts on Facebook, they finish up in prison.
Again, another perfectly valid point to make, one that I keep hearing people say he never makes, despite making it constantly. Two-tick here is effectively is it a Tory meme or a Reform meme? It's a right-wing meme anyway, that Reform played a part in popularising.
This is two-tier Britain. Different groups of people being treated differently according to their own ethnic and racial backgrounds. It is disgusting beyond belief. It says more about this Labour government than anything can.
Hence, in the contract, they say they'll get rid of the Equality Act, or amend it, I think it is. Get rid of this nonsense anyway, which is mainly what you want. So yes, well done Farage for that, but that's not all.
I'm now considering what the next steps are. I'm considering pushing for a judicial review into the rape gang scandal, and I'll report back. What I do know is, whilst the voices of the victims deserve to be heard, if we have an inquiry without statutory powers, it won't achieve a thing. I'm now looking to go down the legal route, and any lawyers out there with bright ideas, please do get in touch. What has happened today is a total cowardly disgrace from the Labour Party, and it sums them up.
Good speech once again. There's absolutely no baggage behind him with being involved in it whatsoever. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that this judicial review idea hasn't come out of nowhere. Back in January, Maggie Oliver of the Maggie Oliver Foundation UK, for those who don't know, Maggie Oliver was a detective in the Greater Manchester Police and resigned because the handling of the Rochdale child sex abuse ring was completely mismanaged and a complete embarrassment, and she couldn't be part of the Greater Manchester Police anymore, and so she's effectively a person who is deeply principled and probably knows more than a lot of people about how to actually deal with this issue. And she, back in January, actually suggested a judicial review. So following 10 days working closely with my legal team, yesterday they submitted a letter before action, a pre-action protocol letter to Yvette Cooper, who is the Secretary of State for the Home Department, and in that letter I have put the Secretary of State on notice that I will commence action in the High Court, a judicial review, unless the Secretary of State publicly confirms that she will implement all 20 of the recommendations in the child sex abuse inquiry, publishes a timetable of implementation for those recommendations, and takes urgent steps to allay widespread public concern regarding the grooming and sexual abuse by organised gangs and groups. Seems perfectly reasonable. I'm glad that she's doing this. But as I say, it seems Reform is going down a similar route. So I've informed the Secretary of State that if she does not agree to these reasonable requests, that I will issue an application to the High Court seeking permission to challenge the Secretary of State's refusal to take action on urgent issues of child sex abuse and child sexual exploitation. I recognise that there are a range of views on these issues amongst survivors, victims and other interested parties. However, I would ask all urgent, tangible and transparent action to combat the epidemic of the abuse of children. I find it interesting that she now plans to deliver a statement in the Commons Day at 2 p.m, and I cannot notice the timing of this following the hand-delivering of this protocol by my lawyers yesterday afternoon. Once I figure out the tech, I plan to share the full letter I sent her, which is over 20 pages. We don't need to go through that to get the idea. So, clearly, this is the type of thing that can actually work. Your private inquiry, clearly it's not worked properly because it's ended up with 4 of these inquiries being cancelled and one still going ahead with the KC, not exactly understanding how it's actually going ahead despite 3 months of work and waiting. So it's not out of the question that Reform could possibly be working with Maggie Oliver, who, as we can see, has at least some idea of how all of this works and how to actually get things done. Private inquiries, when looked into, Reform have decided it's not a great way forward, and I think I find that understandable. Despite promises in the past, if those promises are ultimately going to end up with not much being done as a result, what is the point? They're finding an alternative that could work much better. I'm being told that that is a bad thing. So hopefully the legal route can indeed yield more results. It appears that Maggie Oliver seems to think so, and as I say, she runs an entire foundation looking into what can be done to actually help these poor girls and see the people who committed the crimes be brought to justice. So, again, my faith is still largely in Reform. Anyway, I'll finish off by pointing out Robert Jenrick being the better choice for leader of the Tory party in the last leadership election, has also put out his own statement on this, making the decent point that these inquiries are being cancelled or at least adjusted so that it's at the discretion of local councils, which means that they probably won't be done, or if they are, they'll be watered down. But he won't do a national inquiry into the rape gangs nationally either, despite having all these inquiries set up and setting up all these quangos to deal with other issues that a lot of other people do not see as important. He brings up the two-tier justice point as well, and, well, it does question down the line, is there going to be some sort of Tory and Reform alliance here? I don't think Reform are willing to particularly do that, given how many times they've been betrayed by the Tories and how many people feel betrayed by the Tories as well. And it doesn't shock me that there's insiders in the Tory party saying they're probably going to have no choice but to ally with Reform. It's all up in the air and it's all a bit strange, but it is clear that both are parallel on a few issues, this obviously being one of them. Anyway, I think with that, that is everything I have for you for today. Once again, who's surprised? Labour are moral cowards, Tories have found their backbone in opposition. Reform are saying what, well, Farage specifically, but Reform are saying what they have been saying basically forever. Lib Dems somehow coming off worse out of all this despite having the least to do with it, because they're just trying to get the worst aspect of both Tories and Labour into the one thing they had to say in this whole affair. Right, anyway, with that, there will be Tosh Talks next Tuesday, Laughing at the Guardian next Thursday. Videos out as and when I can make them. If you want to help out the channel, do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment as well. Give me money via Super Chats or Super Thanks, or become a member as well. And once again, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.